He told her plainly, standing in the middle of a Wyoming yard, with snow still patching the ground and a sky the color of an old bruise. "I didn't send for a wife, I sent for someone who could teach my son." Margot Finley had traveled 6 days on 2 trains and a borrowed wagon to get here. She looked at the man in front of her, tall, weathered somewhere past 40, eyes that flit gray of river ice. And she looked at the boy standing half behind him, small and fair-haired, and watching her with something that was not curiosity but harder than that. She looked at the ranch house behind them both, its shutters uneven, its porch sagging on one corner, its windows filmed with the particular dust of a place where nobody was paying attention anymore. She said, "Then point me to where he sleeps and I'll start in the morning." What neither of them knew, standing in that frozen yard with the wind cutting between them like something with an opinion, was that the boy was not the thing that needed the most teaching. And she had not come all this way to be a schoolmarm. She had come because there was nothing left behind her, and because sometimes that is reason enough to keep moving forward. Subscribe to Dusty Heart and stay with this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment below. Tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. The letter had come to Margot Finley in late October, when the school in Millfield, Ohio had been closed for 4 months, and she had been living on what she'd saved, and on the particular stubbornness that had always been her best and worst quality in equal measure. She was 28 years old. She had been engaged once to a man named Douglas who had decided, when the school board voted to shut the Millfield schoolhouse in favor of a consolidated building 2 towns over, that a woman without a salary was a woman without a future worth building toward. He had not said this exactly. He had said other things, reasonable things, careful things, but that was what he meant, and Margot had understood it clearly enough to give back his ring and not cry until after he had left. That was July. By October, she had answered 14 notices in the newspaper and received 3 responses and 2 job offers, both of them for positions in cities, both of them for work she could do but would not love. And then she found the notice that Seth Brennan of Clearwater, Wyoming Territory, had placed in the Ohio Gazette through a correspondence agency, and something in the wording of it stopped her in a way the others had not. The notice said, "Widower with young son, ranch work is steady, needs someone who can teach. Not looking for romantic notions. If you are practical and willing, write back." She had read it twice. She had thought, practical and willing. She had thought, I am both of those things. She wrote back that same evening. The correspondence that followed over 6 weeks was brief and businesslike on both ends. Seth Brennan wrote the way a man drives a fence post, direct, no wasted motion, nothing decorative. He told her the boy was 8, that his name was Eli, that he had not been in school for 2 years because the nearest schoolhouse was 11 miles, and the weather in Wyoming did not cooperate. He told her the ranch ran sheep, not cattle, which he seemed to feel required some explanation. He told her the winters were long, and the work was genuine. He asked what she could teach, and she told him, reading, writing, arithmetic, some Latin, some geography, and how to keep a proper account book. He wrote back 1 word of approval, good, and a date for her to arrive. She had not told herself it would be easy. She had told herself what she always told herself when the ground felt uncertain. You can manage. You always manage. She arrived on a Thursday in November with 1 trunk and a carpet bag, and the particular fatigue of a woman who has been on a train for 5 days and has spent most of that time deliberately not thinking. The ranch hand who collected her from the Clearwater depot, a lean, sun-darkened man named Walt, who offered almost nothing in the way of conversation, drove her out to the Brennan ranch in a wagon that rattled in a way suggesting it too had seen better decades. The house, when it came into view, was larger than she had expected and quieter than seemed right. She would learn later that Seth Brennan ran 1,200 sheep on 3,000 acres with 2 hands and a dog named Pepper, and that the silence of the place came not from emptiness of land, but from emptiness of something else. Something that had departed 3 years ago and left the house rearranged around its absence. Seth was in the yard when the wagon pulled in. He did not come toward her. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched her climb down, and when she walked to him with her hand extended, the way she would have introduced herself to anyone, he looked at her hand for one unreadable moment before taking it. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "I'm Margot Finley." "You're younger than the letter suggested," he said. "You're more direct than your correspondence suggested," she replied. Something shifted behind his eyes, not warmth, but the faintest acknowledgement of something. Then it was gone. He turned toward the house and said, without looking back, "Ellie's inside. He knows you're coming. That doesn't mean he'll cooperate." She followed him in. The house had the bones of something that had once been carefully kept. The kitchen was clean but not arranged. Things put away without thought about where they ought to live. In the parlor, there was a chair with a half-finished quilt folded over the arm, the colors still bright, the stitching only 3/4 complete. A woman's reading glasses sat on the windowsill, folded neatly, as though someone had set them down for a moment and would be back. Margot noticed both of these things. She said nothing. Eli was sitting at the kitchen table. He was small for 8, with his father's gray eyes and a jaw that had been set against the world for a while now. He looked at her when she came in. He did not speak. "Eli," Seth said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has said this name in this tone many times before, threading the needle between authority and something more complicated. "This is Miss Finley." "I know," Eli said, still watching her. Margot put her bag down and sat across from him at the table, without being invited to, the way she had always sat at a child's level back in Ohio. "I heard you used to like to read," she said. "Who told you that?" "Your father's letter." Eli looked at his father with an expression that held some accusation. Seth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It was your mother's favorite thing," he said to his son, not to Margot, and the sentence cost him something she could hear in the flatness he worked to maintain. "It doesn't mean it can't still be yours." Eli did not answer. He looked back at the table. Margot let it sit. She had learned long ago that pressing a child who had already decided something was the fastest way to confirm them in that decision. She looked at Seth instead. "Where would you like me to start with supper?" He blinked. It was the first time she had seen him look surprised. The first week was an exercise in patience, which was a thing Margot possessed in some quantity. Seth moved through the house like a man who had made a private arrangement with himself never to need anyone for anything, and he maintained this with a thoroughness that might have been impressive under different circumstances. He was up before light. He came in for meals and little else. He gave her a written list of responsibilities on the second morning. Eli's lessons, the household accounts, what provisions needed ordering, in a hand that was blunt and economy-minded. She did the things on the list, and then she did more, because the house needed more, and because she was not the kind of woman who worked to a minimum. Eli was a different problem entirely. He would sit for lessons. He would do arithmetic with the focused, reluctant precision of someone performing a task under protest, but unwilling to do it wrong. But he would not read. Not aloud, not silently, not any book she set in front of him. When she asked him to, he looked at the page for a long, quiet moment and said, "I don't want to." She did not push. Instead, she opened her own book. She had brought 3, and she read to him. Not a story she thought a child would like, but the book she herself was reading. A history of the American West, specific and detailed, written for someone who could handle real information. She read a passage about the Rocky Mountains. She read about the Shoshone people who had named the rivers. She watched Eli from the corner of her eye and saw him listening despite himself. On the 5th day, he said, without looking up from the arithmetic she had assigned, "What happens to the beaver trappers?" "Read the next chapter and find out," she said. He looked at the book for a moment. Then he reached for it. She kept her face entirely still and continued her own work. Seth saw none of this. He was rarely in the house in the daylight hours, and when he was, he moved around her with the practiced distance of a man who has learned to share space without sharing it. She understood it. She did not require him to be other than he was. But she watched him, the way she watched all her students, with the particular attention paid to understand rather than to judge. What she saw was a man who was surviving rather than living, and who knew it and had decided that was sufficient. The breaking point arrived from outside the ranch. Vernon Brennan appeared on a Saturday morning in the 3rd week, and Margot knew who he was before Seth introduced him, because the resemblance was there in the jaw and the bearing, but everything else was different. Where Seth was contained, Vernon was expansive. Where Seth spent words like they cost something, Vernon distributed them freely. He was perhaps 50, well-fed, with the comfortable authority of a man who had spent years finding that things arranged themselves in his favor. He looked at Margot when Seth introduced her and smiled with all his face except his eyes. "So the correspondent arrived," he said pleasantly. "Seth, you didn't mention she was young." "She's here for Eli's schooling," Seth said. The flatness in his voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. Of course, of course." Vernon's attention moved around the house in the particular way of a man performing an assessment he's pretending is casual. The place is looking better. Some attention does the place good. He turned back to Seth with the ease of someone who has always held the upper hand and stopped expecting resistance. "I've had a man come out from the bank in Laramie, just to look at the land assessment. Nothing official." Seth's stillness changed quality. Margot recognized it. The stillness of a man who has been expecting something and is deciding how to receive it. "The land's not for sale," Seth said. Nobody said sale. Vernon glanced at Margot, suggesting he would have preferred this conversation to be private. She did not move. "Father's will has a partition clause, Seth. If both of us agreed to divide the acreage, we could each hold our portion separately. It might be simpler. Given everything." "Given what everything?" Seth said. Vernon looked at him steadily. "Given that you've been running this place on 2 hands and a dog for 3 years and the numbers don't work, and you know it." He said it gently. That was the most damaging way to say it. "I'm not trying to take anything. I'm trying to offer you a way out." "There's no way out that involves dividing this land," Seth said. "We're done talking about this." Vernon looked at Margot one final time before he left, and the look said clearly, "You are a complication I will have to account for." She met the look without flinching. He put on his hat and went. Seth stood in the middle of the kitchen after the wagon sounds had faded and said nothing. "Is that a regular occurrence?" she asked. "Getting more regular," he said. She set the kettle on without being asked and sat down at the table. He looked at her as if he had not quite decided what she was doing there. "Tell me about the partition clause," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down and told her. Their father had left the ranch jointly to both sons. There was a clause in the will, poorly written by a lawyer who had charged too much and delivered too little, that allowed either brother to petition for partition after 2 years of what the document described as unproductive stewardship. Vernon had been quietly building a case, arguing to the county land office that Seth's operation had declined since his wife's death and no longer met the standard the will required. "He's not wrong that the numbers have been difficult," Seth said, with the particular honesty of a man who has made peace with a hard fact. 2 bad seasons. Wool prices dropped. I've been carrying a note I shouldn't still be carrying." "What does the will say about stewardship specifically?" Margot asked. "What exactly does it define?" He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if it's defined, you can prove you meet it. If it isn't defined, his petition has no standard to measure against." She held his gaze. "Do you have a copy?" He brought her the document. She read it twice. She asked for the last 2 years of account books. He brought those too, with the look of a man who was not sure what he was watching happen, but was letting it happen. She spent the afternoon going through the accounts and the will with the focused attention of someone who has spent years teaching children to read carefully and has never stopped applying that skill to everything else. What she found by evening was this. The will's definition of unproductive stewardship required not profit but active management and continuous habitation. Seth had both. The land was worked, the sheep were counted and accounted for, the house was occupied. Vernon's case, examined against the actual language, was substantially weaker than he had implied. She laid this out for Seth over supper. He listened the way he listened to everything she had come to understand was important to him, without interrupting, without reacting visibly, with a quality of attention more focused than it looked from the outside. When she finished, he looked at the will and looked at her. "How do you know how to read something like this?" "I kept my school's books," she said. "I wrote the grant applications. I read every contract the board put in front of us, because nobody else did." She set her fork down. "I know what a document looks like when someone has written it to mean more than it says, and I know what it looks like when someone is counting on the other person not to read carefully." He was quiet. "Vernon's been counting on me not to have the energy for a fight." "Yes," she said. "Has he been right?" He looked at the table, and what moved across his face then was not defeat but something more complicated, the expression of a person who has allowed himself to believe he had nothing worth defending and is being interrupted in that belief. Not anymore, he said. Something had changed after that evening, though it was not the kind of change that announced itself. Seth still rose before light. He still moved through the house with his practiced self-sufficiency. But he stopped moving around her. He started talking. Not at length, not with anything like the openness that would have frightened him, but in the way of a man who has begun to consider that another person in the room might be worth addressing directly. And Eli had begun to read. It happened on a Tuesday, without ceremony, which was the only way it could have happened. Margot was at the table writing a letter to the county land office when Eli came and sat across from her and opened the history book to where he had left off and began to read in a voice that was low and careful and trying very hard not to be noticed. She did not look up from her letter. She did not react in any visible way. She let him read for 10 minutes in what was officially still silence between them, and when she heard Seth's boots stop in the doorway and then very deliberately not come closer, she still did not look up. Later, after Eli had gone to bed, Seth stood in the kitchen while she was washing the supper things and said, without preamble, "How did you do that?" "I didn't do anything," she said. "I just waited long enough." He was quiet. She could feel him thinking. Louise, his mother. She used to read to him every night. When she died, he stopped. Wouldn't touch a book. He paused. "I thought he'd decided it belonged to her." "Maybe it did for a while," Margot said. "But grief doesn't take things permanently. It just holds them until someone is ready." He said nothing. In his silence, she heard something she had learned to listen for in this house. Not the closed, defensive quiet of the first weeks, but something more open. The quiet of a man beginning to hear himself. "Louise," she said carefully, "what was she like?" He looked at her with the same surprise he had shown the very first evening. The surprise of someone unused to being asked rather than told. He told her, not everything and not all at once, but he told her about a woman who had loved the mountains with an unreasonableness he had found exasperating and beautiful in roughly equal proportion, who had planted a kitchen garden in soil that was mostly rock and taken a personal satisfaction in proving the soil wrong, who had left that quilt on the parlor chair because she was always starting one project before finishing another and had never been troubled by it. He told her Louise had been the one to teach Eli to read, one letter at a time, sitting in that chair with the unfinished quilt across her lap. She was 31, he said. Fever took her in 4 days. Eli was 5. His voice was level. It cost him to keep it level. "I should have finished the quilt." Margot was quiet for a moment. "Could you?" He looked at her. "I don't know how to sew." "I could show you," she said, "or we could leave it as it is. Either is all right." She held his gaze. "Some things don't have to be resolved. They just have to be acknowledged." He looked at her for a long time. "You are not what I expected," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me that when I arrived." "I didn't say it then," he said. "You meant it then," she said. "You just waited to understand what you meant." He made a sound that was very close to a laugh, not quite, but close enough that she counted it. The confrontation with Vernon came the following week, and it came to Margot first. She had gone into Clearwater to post the letter she had written to the county land office, a careful, specific letter citing the exact language of the will and requesting an official review of Vernon's partition petition on the grounds that the statutory definition of unproductive stewardship had not been met. She was at the post office counter when she heard the door open behind her, and she turned to find Vernon Brennan standing there with the particular stillness of a man who had been waiting for an opportunity. "Mrs. Brennan," he said. He had started calling her that after his first visit, and it was not warmth. "Mr. Vernon," she said. "I'd like to save you some time," he said, coming to stand closer than was comfortable and making no effort to correct this. "Whatever Seth has told you about the land situation, and whatever you think you're doing with correspondence to the county office," he glanced at the envelope in her hand, "I want you to understand that you've been here 6 weeks. You don't know this family. You don't know this county. You don't know what Seth was like before he decided to stop trying." "I know what the will says," she said, specifically and exactly, word by word. Vernon was quiet for a moment. "You read it." "Carefully," she said. "I'd encourage you to do the same." He studied her with the expression of a man deciding whether a person is an obstacle or a problem. "My brother needs someone to run his house," he said finally, more quietly. Not someone to run him. You should think carefully about what you're here for and how long you intend to stay." She kept her face entirely composed. "I'm here because I said I would be," she said, "and I intend to stay because I keep my word." She handed her letter to the postmaster. "Good afternoon, Mr. Vernon." She walked out. She walked to the wagon. She sat in the wagon seat and allowed her hands, which were shaking, to shake until they stopped, about 60 seconds, and then she picked up the reins and drove back to the ranch. She told Seth that evening, all of it, calmly, without editorializing. He listened without moving. When she finished, he stood up and turned to the window, and she watched the back of him in the particular way she had learned to watch Seth Brennan, which was for the small things. The set of the shoulders, the almost imperceptible indications that something was happening beneath the surface he maintained. When he turned back, his face was carefully controlled. "He tried to discourage you," he said. "He tried," she said. "It didn't work." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not gratitude exactly, which was too small a word, but something that had gratitude in it, alongside something else. Something that had been building in the space between them for weeks, growing quietly the way the garden outside the kitchen would grow, come spring, without anyone directing it, simply because the conditions had finally been right. "Why?" he said, and it was not hostile. It was genuinely, quietly baffled. "This is not your fight. You've been here 6 weeks, Margot. You could walk away from all of this and have nothing to lose." She looked at him steadily. "I came here going toward something," she said. "Not away from something. There's a difference, and I know the difference very well." She held his gaze. "This is worth going toward. Eli is worth it. The land is worth it." She paused. "You're worth it, even if you haven't decided that for yourself yet." He said nothing for a long moment. Then something happened that she had not seen from him before. The rigid set of his shoulders released. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. The exhausting effort of holding everything alone, visible for just one moment in the slight dropping of his frame. And then he breathed out and looked at her, with something she recognized as the particular expression of a person who has been carrying something too long and has just been offered, for the first time, an honest place to set it down. "All right," he said quietly. "What do we do next?" The letter from the county land office arrived on a Friday. Walt brought it out from town with the careful speed of a man who understands something important is in his hands. Margot was in the parlor helping Eli through a chapter. Eli reading aloud now, still low and careful, but doing it, and she took the envelope and said, "Get your father." Seth read the letter standing at the kitchen table. She watched his face move through several things in controlled succession. When he set it down and looked at her, she could read the answer in his expression before he said a word. The petition review had found insufficient grounds for partition. Vernon's case did not meet the will's standard for unproductive stewardship. The land remained whole and undivided. Seth's management was confirmed. The petition was closed. Eli said from the doorway, "Does that mean Uncle Vernon can't take the ranch?" "Yes," Margot said. Eli looked at his father. Seth was still looking at Margot. Something in the look was new and visible and entirely unmanaged. "Come here," Seth said to Eli, and the boy came, and Seth put a hand on his shoulder and kept looking at Margot with that open, undefended expression that she thought might be the most honest thing she had ever seen on a human face. "I need to say something," Seth said. His voice was different, the carefully maintained flatness worn thin enough now that what came through it was real. "You could leave now. The petition's closed. The immediate thing is settled. You could." "Seth," she said. "Let me finish." He looked at his son and then back at her. "I want you to stay, not for Eli's reading, not for the accounts." He paused. "I want you to stay because this house has been quiet in the wrong way for 3 years, and it is not quiet in the wrong way anymore, and I do not know how to go back to that." He looked briefly at the table, then up. "I know that is not a poetic thing to say." "I don't need poetry," she said. He looked at her. "You never did," he said quietly. She smiled. It was not a small thing, that smile, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Eli, who had been following this exchange with the grave attention of a child who understands he is witnessing something significant, said, "Are you going to stay, Miss Finley?" Margot looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I am." Eli nodded once with the dignity of someone accepting a satisfactory answer. Then he turned and went back to the parlor and picked up his book. Seth and Margot stood in the kitchen in the particular quiet of a house that had found its right sound again. Through the doorway came the low, careful voice of an 8-year-old boy reading to himself about the mountains of the American West, the rivers named by people who had been there long before any of them, a country that went on further than anyone had the right to expect. After a while, Seth crossed the kitchen and stood beside her and looked out the window at the snow-covered pasture where the sheep moved in slow, wool-heavy clusters against the white. He did not touch her. He simply stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold kitchen air, and that was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. She reached over and lifted the half-finished quilt from the arm of the parlor chair. She ran her fingers along the unfinished edge, feeling the careful stitching and the place where it stopped. Seth, watching her, said nothing. "I'll finish it," she said, "if that's all right." He stood in the doorway and looked at the quilt in her hands for a long private moment. Then he said, "It's all right." And his voice was entirely certain, the way it was when he said things he had completely decided and would not take back. She sat down in the chair and began. Outside the window, the snow was just starting to thin at the edges, the way Wyoming snow did in the weeks before anyone dared call it. Spring not gone, not yielding, but beginning, almost imperceptibly, to reconsider. The sky above the ridge was the pale, clean blue that came before longer days. Inside, the fire was burning. A boy was reading. A man was standing in the doorway with his arms at his sides, and something settled and new in the set of his shoulders. Margot threaded her needle and pulled the first stitch through, and listened to all of it. The fire, the reading, the particular silence of a person nearby, who is glad of where he is. And she thought about the letter she had answered in October, sitting in a boarding house in Ohio with no salary, and a returned ring, and the stubbornness that had always served her better than anything else she owned. Practical and willing, the notice had said. She was both of those things still. She had always been both of those things. She had come here going toward something, and she had found it, the way you find things when you stop waiting for them to arrive already finished and start building them yourself, one careful stitch at a time, in the cold and the quiet, with your hands steady and your eyes open and enough patience to wait for what is worth waiting for. The spring was coming. It always did.